Welcome to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, January 18th, 2023. We are in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 31. Let's begin in verse 1. Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines pressed hard after Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day. The war with the Philistines has come, and today the Philistines began to be victorious. This was God's purpose in finally getting Saul off the throne, and it was a sad end. The Philistine army inflicted heavy losses on Israel, and the army fled. Saul and his sons stayed on the battlefield and continued to fight. There was probably other valiant warriors out there, but we know nothing of them. And Saul's sons died in battle. And eventually the archers hit King Saul and critically wounded him. He was probably fatally wounded with the technologies of that day. I wouldn't say that he was probably technically fatally wounded by today's standards, but we have ability to save life today that we didn't then. And he knows he's dying. He asked his armor bearer to kill him so that it wouldn't be the Philistines that killed him. And his armor bearer is scared and refuses to. Probably doesn't want to kill his own king, doesn't want that shame on him. And Saul, being despondent and knowing the situation was hopeless, instead of fighting on, puts his sword hilt down the ground so it's standing up, and he falls on his own sword and commits suicide. And when the armor bearer sees that Saul has committed suicide, he too does the same thing. And so Saul and all the men around him. This doesn't mean everybody in the whole kingdom has died on the battlefield. We'll find out in a few chapters that there was indeed generals left and important people left. Just the people around Saul that would have defended him. The thing was, the Philistines were not directly fighting Saul at this point. It was the archers that hit him. They hit him from a distance. He had a chance to run. He had a chance to fight on. He was probably exhausted, and that can lead to depression. But he's also been cycling between manic and depressed the last several chapters. And this evil spirit of depression hit him, and he saw that the battle was going badly, and he makes the probably sound assumption that he's going to die in battle. And instead of dying in battle and dying as a warrior, he takes the cheap route and commits suicide. Verse 7. When the Israelites along the valley and those across the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled, and the Philistines came and occupied them. So this is fairly common in warfare at that time. The battle would be fought on the border between two countries, and the citizens of the losing country very often abandoned, so they wouldn't be overtaken by the army of the victorious army. And then the victorious army basically moved into the cities and expanded their territory. And that's what the Philistines and the Israelites were fighting over, where the border was and who controlled how much land. And so from Philistines' point of view, they won and they got in territory. They did exactly what they were meaning to do. They have a bigger country than they did yesterday. Verse 8. The next day, when the Philistines came out to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. It was common practice that the day after the battle, people would go out and collect their dead, bury their own dead. If they found bodies of the enemy, they might burn them to prevent the land from being contaminated. They might leave them there to rot. They very often stripped them of anything useful, armor, weapons, anything else that they might have carried into battle, and left them for the wild animals to eat. In that process, they also would go out and find wounded and take their wounded back, kill the enemy wounded. That was just kind of the way it went. And we know a little later time, there was organized groups that would go out on the battlefield at dusk and look for the wounded and kill the wounded of the enemy and take the wounded of their side in. And the Romans got very famous for doing that and doing it well. Had organized groups that went out and did it. But we have records back as far as the Assyrians that they did that they would bring their own wounded in and kill the wounded of the enemy every night after battle, even if it's a multi-day battle. There would be people going through the battlefield. And if they found important people killed on the battlefield, then they would also take possession of the important people's body, particularly their own, to honor their own dead. But if they found princes or generals or kings on the battlefield dead, take them back to gloat over them. We don't have records that the Israelites or the Philistines did that, but apparently here they're essentially doing that the next day. They're going out and looking to see who's dead and what they can loot from dead bodies. And they find Saul and his sons. And they strip them of armor. They cut off the head of Saul and his sons. They leave everybody else's body there. They take Saul's body and the four heads, and take them back to their own cities. And the armor they put in the temple of the Ashtoreths. That's kind of an interesting insult. Baal was their main god, and Ashtoreth was his consort. She was a female goddess. She was not a god of war. Her place was not to defeat the enemy. Normally, if you gloated over an enemy, you put him in Baal's temple. It's kind of an insult to put him in the goddess's temple. So they're insulting Saul by putting his armor there. But they hung his body and his the heads, on the wall of Bethshan. That was one of the Philistine cities. It wasn't one of the major Philistine cities. It wasn't even the closest Philistine city. But they're displaying to the public that they've killed their enemy. And they're doing it in a very insulting way. Because let's face it, the armor is in the temple, the body is on the wall. So at most he has underwear on, maybe less. And they're displaying it, gloating that they've won. Verse 11. When the people of Jabesh Gilead heard that the Philistines had done, what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men journeyed through the night to Bethshan. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Bethshan and went to Jabesh, where they burned them. Then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree in Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days. So Jabesh Gilead, and we've heard of that city several times in the Judges. It's apparently a valiant city. They heard the insult, and their warriors devised a plan. We're going to at least stop the insult. We can't win the battle, we can't bring them back, but we can prevent them from gloating over the bodies. So they got together and they traveled all night, did a surprise attack, grabbed the bodies off the wall, and ran back to Israelite territory. When they got back home to their home district, they burned the bodies. Now, this has probably been several days, so the bodies are beginning to decompose. They're cleansing the bodies in the process of burning. They burn them, and then they bury what's left. So there's no memorial to Saul. There's no king's tomb. They bury it under a tamarisk tree. It's just in the woods, so to speak. They do him the honor of leaving him not in dishonor. They would have also been able to verify what kind of wounds he had. They were warriors after all, and were probably familiar with wounds and what killed him. They could see the sword wound was what killed him, not the arrow wounds. They probably knew he was in grievous shape from the arrow wounds. So they could verify whoever collected the account that came back and got recorded here of how he died and verified. And obviously somebody has gone to some effort to find people who saw it and then fled and recorded all this and got an accurate accounting of what happened. And then after we'll come back to the recording in just a minute. But then after they did that, since they've handled dead bodies, they are unclean. There's a 7-day cleansing ritual in which they have to bathe twice, once in the middle of the week and once at the end, and change clothes and wash the clothes and shave all over. And there's a ritual there. So that's why the 7 days. But that whole time they fasted. They were mourning for Saul and his sons. They knew they were without a king in Israel now. But they had done what honor they could to Saul. I'm going to stop here just a moment to do some teaching about the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Christians call it 2 books. They've split it into 2 here at the end of chapter 31 and started a new book that they call 2nd Samuel in the next verse. In the Hebrew originally, 1st and 2nd Samuel were 1 book. They were 1 scroll. It wasn't like this is where the scrolls ended. The scrolls were only so big, and this. It was actually when they translated out of the Hebrew into Greek to create the Septuagint that they divided it. And apparently the ones who translated it, when they translated it into Greek, they could not fit it physically onto 1 scroll in Greek, so they divided it here. We do not have good reason for why they divided. but they divided it into two books. They recognize, and the Jews even today say Samuel is one book. They don't say First and Second Samuel. Likewise, First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles, the Jews have them as one book. It's Kings, it's Chronicles. It was not divided, but it was in the Septuagint, the Greek translation, where it got divided. And that's where it became divided. Now, the Christians, they used the Greek translation. They didn't use the Hebrew. They used the Greek translation they had, the Septuagint, and consequently, it was two books to them. And the Christian tradition is First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles. The Jewish tradition is it's Samuel, it's Kings, it's Chronicles. And if you read it from the end of First Samuel to the beginning of Second Samuel, you'll see that it makes no sense that it was divided here. It is one continuous narrative. There is no change. If they had, in the ancient world, if they made one book but it's too big for a scroll, they would put it on two scrolls. But at the end of one scroll, they would close it, so if you only had the one scroll, it closed. And then the beginning of the next one, they would start it with a very small introduction so that that's the only scroll you had, you still had a beginning. You didn't just jump in the middle and start. Of course, chapters and verses got added much, much later. And so the division here, if you read it, and let me just read the chapter 31, verse 13 through 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1, and you'll see. Then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree in Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days. After the death of Saul, David returned from defeating the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. So, that makes total sense. It's not like one scroll ended and they summed it up, and then the next scroll started and they summarized. There was no discontinuity here. There was no indication that this was a midpoint in the story, a mid-break, going from one scroll to another. This was continuous. Yeah, it's a change of idea, and it's a reasonable place if you're going to divide a chapter where you would divide it. The people who made the chapters knew that. And the people who made the Septuagint knew if you were going to divide it here, this is an ideal place to divide it. And so they did. Their reasons for dividing it, we don't have. We have some guesses, and there's hypothesis. And I'm going to leave that for a graduate level course. This is not that place to discuss that. But it was made in the Septuagint. In the Hebrew, it's one book. The Christians only using the Greek, not using the Hebrew manuscripts, therefore thought they had two books. And they just named them 1st and 2nd Samuel and went on. So I'm going to start now in 2 Samuel chapter 1 because it does continue the story. Because we've been dealing with David, we've now come to the death of Saul. And chapter 1 actually goes with both chapter 30 and chapter 31, and you'll see here in just a moment why. Starting in verse 1. After the death of Saul, David returned from defeating the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. On the 3rd day, a man arrived from Saul's camp and his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honor. I'm going to pause here just a minute and give you a little bit of timeline. If you remember from chapter 30, they got refused in service. They marched back to Ziklag, got there on the 3rd day. It had been burned. All their people had been captured. They chased after the Amalekites that had burned the city and captured all the people and taken all the booty. And on the third day, they caught up with them. So 6 days after they left the Philistine army, they catch up with the Amalekites. They kill most of the Amalekites. They recover all their people. They recover all their stuff the Amalekites have eaten in those few days. And they then have to travel back to Ziklag. Now, we don't know how far that was, but if fighting men who were angry over the capture of their families, their wives, and their children, and their goods took 3 days to walk there, to get there, you know it took them longer when they were bringing everybody back and bringing the flocks back. It takes longer when you have your goods with you. Coming back a week is a reasonable estimate. Let's face it, the Amalekites got 3 days travel away after they burned Ziklag, and when the fighting men got to Ziklag, that it had been a while. So them having traveled a week is a reasonable estimate. So they've been in Ziklag 2 days when this man shows back up. So it's probably, at least a week after the battle, maybe more. And this man comes in, and his clothes are torn, he's got dust on his hand, which are both signs of mourning. And he finds David, and he falls to the ground, and he gives him honor. He's basically bowing down to him. That's the setup we're in. We're fixing to find out more about him. But he is honoring David. And he's mourning. And we're fixing to find out why. Verse 3. Where have you come from? David asked him. He answered, I have escaped from the Israelite camp. What happened? David asked. Tell me. He said, the men fled from the battle. Many of them fell and died. And Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. So his report, he's telling that the Israelites got defeated and a bunch of men died, and Saul and Jonathan are dead. This is not good news for David. He does not want to see the Israelites defeated. He does not want to see Jonathan dead. He's not really wanting Saul dead. He knows that God will eventually kill him, but God has now killed him. That's the only good news in the whole thing, is God has finally killed Saul. But the rest of it is bad news. And David is going to receive this as bad news. Verse 6. I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, the young man said, and there was Saul leaning on his spear with his chariots and his riders upon him. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, what can I do? He asked me, who are you? An Amalekite, I answered. Then he said to me, stand over me and kill me. I am in the throes of death, but I am still alive. So I stood over him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm, and have brought them to my Lord. Now we know from the man's own account he is lying. His account is different than what the writers that we call 1 Samuel recorded. In chapter 31, Saul was grievously injured with arrow wounds, and he and his armor bearer are there. There was possibly other people, because we have record of it. Somebody, it could have been servants or whatever that was there, not warriors. And they fled with the information. But he was still upright, and he was wounded. He was despondent. He put his hilt in the ground so that the sword was upright, and he fell onto it to stab himself with his own sword, and he died. And therefore, he would not have been standing up on his spear. He probably actually had to separate his armor to be able to fall on his own sword and kill himself. He would not have been leaning on his spear. The Amalekite invents his death and said that the Amalekite, killed Saul at Saul's request. He may have heard a story that Saul had requested for his armor bearer to kill him. The Amalekite is hoping to score points with David, thinking that David and Saul are enemies and that they are in competition for the throne. David is trusting God, not trying to get the throne on his own, and he is waiting his turn. He does not think the death of Saul is a good thing. That Saul is not chasing him anymore is the only good out of it, but that's the only good thing. And David understands the gravity of the situation, is not hoping for Saul's death, even though he knows God will eventually kill him. That now that Saul is dead, that's important, yes. When David finally gets the story from the people of Jabesh in Gilead, he's going to know from them that he was not run through by somebody else's sword, but he fell on his own sword. The wound will be somewhat different, and they would know the difference fighting men at that time. But David also knows that he is lying directly because the man contradicts himself in his own story. He says the chariots and riders were upon him, and he turned around and called to me, and I asked him what I can do, and he asked, and he says he's an Amalekite. Now, let's face it, David and his men have just spent within the last 2 weeks, chasing down a whole bunch of Amalekites and killed them to retrieve their own people. They're not real happy with Amalekites right now. Of course, this man doesn't know that. By identifying himself as an Amalekite, there's probably 600 men out there besides David who want to kill him. And probably a few wives and children. All folks. Not a wise thing to do right now. David's wise enough that if the Amalekite had been righteous, he would have protected him. But David is also knowing that he lied. Then the Amalekite says he was standing on his sword. Now he says he came over and stood over him and struck him with his own sword. If you're standing up, the Amalekite's not going to be standing over you. If you're on the ground, you're not leaning on your sword, your spear. So David has caught the Amalekite lying. He knows that the man has invented some sort of story. He also does know Saul's crown and armband, and knows the Amalekite has seen Saul dead to be able to take them from him. So most likely the story of really what happened, the Amalekite was going through the battlefields looking what he can loot before the Philistines got there. He happened upon Saul and his sons, saw them dead. He found the crown, the armband, and he took them because they're valuable. He's hoping to trade them for favors and or money with somebody. And he's probably not well received by the Israelites or by the Philistines. And so he's kind of running for his life. And he gets this idea, well, hey, David's an enemy of Saul, and he wasn't on the battlefield, so maybe he'll be happy with me. Not knowing that his relatives sacked David's city and carried everybody off as booty, and the David's men went and killed them and got all the goods back and all the people back. And he goes to Ziklag. Now, he mourns, he puts on he tears his clothes, he puts on the dirt and the ashes, and he mourns because he probably would prefer the Israelites who had some sort of decency and ethics and morality to the Philistines who didn't like the Amalekites any more than the Israelites did, but and actually viewed them probably a little worse. The Israelites at least said the Amalekites were Abraham's descendants, even though they're our competitors. The Philistines they're fighting everybody right now. And he goes to Ziklag and he tells his story. He has embellished it. He's talked about it in his head enough that it comes across, if you didn't understand the details well, like it might be the truth. But David knows that you're not standing on your sword and laying on the ground, standing on your spear and laying on the ground at the same time. He knows the Amalekite has somewhere lied, and he has King Saul's crown and armband, and he testifies by his own mouth he killed Saul. Regicide is a fatal offense. I don't care what culture you're in. Unless the person you're reporting to is the rebel hoping to replace the king, almost anywhere in the world, any culture, admitting you killed the current king gets you killed. Now, if the guy you're reporting to is going to be the new king, he might consider it a good thing and reward you. However, a lot of cultures, they also understand that anybody who kills the king might kill the next king. A lot of incoming kings will take out the person that killed the old king unless they were directly under their orders when they did it. Yeah, David, this Amalekite has a bunch of strikes with him. He's an Amalekite. He claims he killed Saul. He's got Saul's stuff. You know, David makes a snap decision. Verse 11. Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young man who brought him the report, "Where are you from?" "I am the son of an alien, Amalekite," he answered. David asked him, "Why were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of his men and said, "Go strike him down." So he struck him down and he died. For David said to him, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" So David makes this righteous decision that you testified you killed Saul, you die. And he had an executioner come and kill him. He knows the Amalekite is lying. He doesn't know whether the Amalekite is lying about killing Saul, and he doesn't really want to spend a lot of time to try to figure out, is he lying about killing Saul, or is he lying about how it happened? It really doesn't matter to David. He has evidence that he's been with the dead Saul. Stole the crown, and let's face it, stealing the crown was probably a fatal offense right there. If you said that you were scavenging the battlefield and you found that Saul dead and you wanted to bring some evidence he was and tell David that might not be a fatal offense. That might just be, you know, good. You kept the Philistines from looting it kind of moment. And you brought me proof that Saul's dead. Yeah. But the Amalekite didn't do that. And he told David, I killed him. David just makes that snap decision. You're not fit to live. David told him that. He told the young men to execute him, and they did. And that's the end of the Amalekite. He didn't necessarily get a fair trial, but it was, by the standards of the day, a very fair trial. He testified about the important part. I killed Saul. And David accepted that testimony and says, okay, your own mouth, you said you killed Saul, you're worthy of death, and had him killed. David was righteous in that. Now, the facts of it, the Amalekite did not kill Saul. He instead was a little more than a grave robber. But David and his men don't know that. David and his men have some prejudice against the Amalekites. They have no reason to think better of him than you might kill Saul. They might even agree with the Amalekite, okay, he was fatally wounded and he was going to die on his own, but they would still be like the armor bearer, very reluctant to kill the king. Let him die on his own. Let's face it, they were very valiant men, and in the same place on the battlefield, they would have probably kept fighting, hoping God would bring a miracle, and they would somehow win anyway, until they were killed. And when we get to later parts of 2 Samuel, we're going to find places where some of these men did phenomenal feats, killed hundreds of men by themselves in desperate odds and things like that, and stood their ground when it looks like I'm going to die. But they stood their ground and they did their best, and God had them win. And that's things in the future yet for these men, but that's the kind of character they are. So they understand the battlefield. They're already warriors. They've already fought. They've already done battle. They've already killed people. And they know that until you're dead, you keep fighting. They would have assumed that of Saul too, and Jonathan and the armor bearer and the others. So they have no reason to think that Amalekite lied about killing Saul. And they see David's sentence upon him as just. Self-testimony in court generally is accepted unless there is some good evidence you lied. Now, David did have some good evidence he lied, but he didn't know what he lied about. And the big important point, Saul's dead, and you said you did it. Okay, you're worthy of death. If you supported his death, even if you didn't do it yourself, you might have been worthy of death under these kind of conditions. Your self-testimony condemns you. And that's basically the decision David made and had him executed. I think I'm going to stop here. David laments for Jonathan because Jonathan died. David and Jonathan were very close to each other. And that's the second half of chapter 1. But chapter 31 and the first half of 2 Samuel 1 are parts and parcels of the same story that started when David marched off to go help the Philistines in war, and then God had the Philistine commander's heart send him back. So he was not directly involved in the war. And he had to go save his people, and he killed a bunch of Amalekites, and he's come back. And they're still in grief. They're still in that. Probably they have at this point cleansed themselves for having killed all those people. It's probably been that long. And then now they've executed judgment against the man that testified he killed. It'll be probably months before David knows that the Amalekite indeed did not kill Saul, that he committed suicide. It may be years. We don't know exactly how long it would have taken David to hear the real truth. Obviously, the writer of Samuel, the writers, is probably a committee, do get the truth, and they get both sides of it, and they record it. And we now know how Saul died. He committed suicide. And we know this Amalekite indeed did not abuse Saul and did not kill him, but he lied to David, and that was sufficient. We know from his own story and how he tells it that he's lying, how it's recorded. Because his story does not match the actual truth. We know it's invented. He misses details. Holy Father, you were the one that brought about the death of Saul. He committed suicide by his own hand, but he was going to be killed in battle anyway if he hadn't been a coward to kill himself. And Lord, you kept David righteous, that he could be a righteous king, that he did not destroy the house of Saul. He could fulfill his promise to Jonathan. And now you're preparing David to be the new king, to reign in Saul's absence. Lord, even then, David was acting like a righteous king, executing those who claimed to have killed the king, mourning for the death of the king. Lord, thank you for being in David to having be that kind of man, to be that kind of righteous, that he was a man after your own heart. Lord, help us to be like David, who made right decisions and made them quickly and carried them out, who followed you, obeyed you. When he did make a mistake and he did sin, he admitted to his error and turned back to you and sought how to make it right. Lord, I ask that you make us that kind of people also, that we would be humble before you, that we would be studying your word, seeking your face, that we would be praying and concerned about your things. We would be your servants. And that when we find wrongdoing in us, we'd repent and turn back to you once again. In your gracious name, amen. I am your host, Frank Reich, Associate Pastor of Family Ministry at Grace Fellowship Baptist Church, and this was recorded on Sunday, January 15th, 2023. Y'all have a blessed week. I hope to see you Wednesday at church. If not, I hope to see you Sunday at the worship service. And if nothing else, we'll see you here back on YouTube. Have a blessed week.